The future is a concept. It doesn't exist. As the proverb says, tomorrow never comes. There is no such thing as tomorrow. There never will be, because time is always now.
All right, so we are here with Recluse. He runs an online blog called VISUP. That's VISUP. It's dedicated to exploring the vast 14 realms of mind control, deep politics, sacred geometry, onomatology, and synchronicity, cult film and music, supernatural, the extraterrestrial, and the multidimensional, high weirdness in all its many forms. Recluse, how are you doing today?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Not too bad. I was going through your blog, and it's kind of like a kid in a candy store. There's so much information on there. Today, I kind of wanted to start off with what's going on in Las Vegas. I guess there's some powerful networks out there. I wanted to kind of get your take on who they are and what their function is and how Trump fits into all this.
Well, Trump really, seems to have been recruited early on by this network, and it was most likely Roy Cohn, his infamous former attorney and political mentor. Of course, Cohn having standing ties to the syndicate, the American mafia, whatever you want to call it. And he had, in fact, been one of the figures working with modalists to essentially help set up Las Vegas back in the 1950s and so forth. And it really became a mecca for money laundering. And of course, casinos are really ideal for this type of thing, especially going into the 21st century, because casinos are really one of the few entities left that deal with physical cash. You know what I'm saying? It's not all just on a card or something like that. But historically, I mean, this was a great way for money laundering. You could easily misreport the amount of funds that you were taking in. You could sneak in funds from other sources and so forth. And this really led to kind of a wide network of different gaming interests that the mob had set up across originally in the Caribbean and the Bahamas and so forth. And certainly it seems to have spread to the rest of the world as time has gone on. But Trump was really much plugged into this, and he seems to have picked up some other contacts later on, such as Robert Bigelow, who's now primarily known for his ties to the UFO field and so forth. But Bigelow, he really cut his teeth in real estate, specifically in the Nevada area, and real estate has been another industry that's just been extremely heavily infiltrated by the syndicate for decades now. And that does raise some rather curious possibilities as to what exactly Bigelow was doing, especially with these, reputed allegations that he's also been, kind of involved in reverse engineering parts taken from UFOs or something to that effect. It's really, quite an elaborate setup. And the fact that you have Vegas there next to Area 51, in my opinion, is very telling. This was something that I really kind of started to look into with Epstein, but it seems like a lot of these illicit funds that have been generated, be it through sex trafficking, through arms trafficking, through drug trafficking, have been used to facilitate covert research on these black projects for years now. So you have this just major money laundering center here in Las Vegas that's very close to Area 51. And then you go a little further south, you've got the whole Los Alamos network of research labs there that were involved in the Manhattan Project. Reportedly, they were also heavily tied in some of the UFO research and a lot of other nefarious things. Epstein's down there in New Mexico. So, I mean, there's a lot of very shadowy connections in this whole region of the world, really.
That is strange. In the Bigelow airspace, was that the one that had something to do with the ATIP program that was being promoted by the To the Stars Academy, or was that a separate?
Yeah. Several of the program that Bigelow was sponsoring, yes, the military officer who was head of that project, if I remember correctly, ended up joining To the Stars Academy afterwards.
Okay.
So yeah, Bigelow definitely seems to have been kind of linked into that network, though Bigelow definitely seems to have been closer to Trump than some of the other two, the Stars people who appear to have been Hillary supporters. Certainly, Bigelow seems like he's poised to benefit tremendously financially from Trump's attempts to militarize space, certainly.
And then that's interesting with the Epstein thing because I think he had a place nearby, like you said, the Los Alamos Labs there in New Mexico. One of his some paperwork that was online that one of the girls had said that he called himself a behavioral scientist, and that kind of piqued my interest because with the MK Ultra stuff. If you wanted to maybe touch on what was MK Ultra.
Hey, Ultra was set up in around 1953, though I think the genesis had going back to maybe 52, 51, somewhere thereabouts, and it was housed in the technical services staff and was overseen by Sidney Gottlieb. And of course, this get into a lot of the early attempts at behavioral modifications, quote unquote, mind control. But I mean, also there were a lot of other kind of arcane topics that were researched by MK Ultra, and even more so by its predecessor slash rival, which was Project Artichoke. And I always like to point this out because it gets badly misrepresented in a lot of the accounts. But Artichoke and MK Ultra were separate programs. The Artichoke was never rolled into MK Ultra as is often claimed, and Artichoke continued to coexist with MK Ultra for many years afterwards. In fact, I think they were both wrapped up around 1963, and then there were various sub-projects that were spawned by both programs that continued probably to about the time of the Watergate scandal in 73, 74, thereabouts. And then after that, there was another program that's been linked to a lot of these, same types of shenanigans that was known as MK Often, and Often was also housed in a different part of the CIA than Artichoke or MK Ultra. MK Ultra was TSS. Artichoke was under the Office of Security and then briefly the Office of Scientific Intelligence before it went back to the OS. And Often was in the Office of Research and Development. So there was definitely a certain compartmentalization to these programs, and I'm a little skeptical of the overlap between them, which a lot of other researchers kind of latch on. I mean, for instance, Gordon Thomas in his book Journey into Madness made a lot of allegations about Often being spawned by Sidney Gottlieb's work in MK Ultra, but I frankly have found nothing at all to confirm that Gottlieb had any kind of involvement in MK Often, and Thomas definitely has embellished some things in terms of this type of research that Hank Albarella especially highlighted in A Terrible Mistake. So certainly some of his claims should be taken with a grain of salt.
How does Bluebird tie into all this?
Bluebird was the first one, and that was essentially the one that was eventually rolled into Artichoke. Bluebird had been started in, I think, 1949, and it had been initiated by Admiral Roscoe Hillenkotter, and a lot of the same personnel who had been involved with Bluebird, most notably Morris Allen, ended up going to work with Artichoke in 51 or 52. And the other thing about Artichoke that kind of distinguishes it from MK Ultra is the fact that MK Ultra was strictly a CIA project. Artichoke was a joint CIA/Pentagon project because the Pentagon itself had its own behavior modification programs that were going on concurrently. One of the more infamous was Pelican, and then there was also Project Chatter, both of which had been started by the U.S. Navy, for instance. But all the branches of the intelligence services, the armed forces, such as the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and God, however many dozen of intelligence agencies the U.S. Army had, most notably the Counterintelligence Corps, that was really the big one, but those were all involved in Artichoke along with the CIA people. And essentially Artichoke seems like it was created to kind of coordinate all of these efforts, because you had the CIA doing Bluebird, and the Navy was doing Chatter and Pelican, and the CIC was up to God knows what, and now everybody was theoretically going to share notes and what have you, though it didn't always quite work out that way.
What were some of the stuff that they were working on and trying to do with their research in some of these programs?
Well, in the case of Artichoke, I mean, the two kind of stated objectives, the first and really prevalent one that you see listed a lot in accounts of it was essentially to develop quote unquote special interrogation methods. And then another kind of objective that is not really talked about a lot was to create what in the era was kind of referred to as quote unquote more aggressive soldiers, but in this day and age, what we would consider to be super soldiers essentially. And that's where the Navy project, Project Pelican, is especially ominous because the way it's been described is almost like a full blown Clockwork Orange type procedure where essentially Navy personnel were being groomed to become more effective assassins. And to this end, they would be strapped into a chair and their eyes would be clamped open and they would be injected in drugs and they would essentially be shown films over and over again that depicted, you know, children being murdered and all kinds of other scenes of extreme violence and so forth, which theoretically would desensitize them to this and make them into more efficient killers once they were released into the world, so to speak. And then also, I mean, it seems like after a while, you know, it went beyond just simply trying to make soldiers more effective killers, and it went into some really kind of fringy, arcane stuff. I mean, I really think that this is where a lot of the remote viewing experiments derived from. Of course, the interest in psi did originate with Project Artichoke, and I guess would be that this was kind of a component of this research for super soldiers. Obviously, you know, if you had soldiers that had some kind of psi ability or something related to it, I'm thinking especially like is it telekinesis where you can physically grab something with your mind? I get some of this terminology confused. Yeah, I believe. Apologies if I'm getting this terminology wrong. I didn't have a chance to brush up on it before this, but I think telekinesis is where you could physically move an object with your mind. And, you know, if you're trying to create an assassin, for instance, well, somebody could reach in and grab somebody's heart and squeeze it ever so subtly and kill them in this process. That would be very compelling because it would look superficially like it was simply a heart attack.
Yeah.
So, you know, for these purposes, it would have been a highly appealing route to research for super soldiers, essentially.
Does any of this super soldier research they're trying to create these assassins, does that have anything to do with the special operations executive branch in those assassination groups, or is that a separate entity?
Well, kind of, maybe. The Special Operations Executive was a British organization that was created in 1940. There had been some predecessors in MI6. I believe it was Section D, but eventually these assets were taken out of MI6 and they were put into a wartime ministry that was known as the Ministry of Economic Warfare in the UK. And this entity had direct control of the Special Operations Executive. And I need to probably give you some details here because I know this isn't really something your readers are very familiar with. But okay, so let's start with the Office of Strategic Services. Okay, this was the predecessor to the CIA, and in various accounts, it said that the OSS was inspired either by MI6, the UK's principal foreign intelligence service, or SOE, which was the Special Operations Executive, which was another major intelligence service. Now, essentially, the Office of Strategic Services was a combination of the two. The OSS was an intelligence gathering body, and it was also a special operations body. Now, conversely, MI6 was just an intelligence gathering body. It did have some special operations capabilities, but they were very, very limited, and as such, it was mainly concerned with intelligence gathering during World War II. Now, the SOE was created because they needed somebody that could carry out these special operations, that could go into the field to carry out assassinations, to sabotage bridges, and so forth. And a lot of what they were doing would now fall under the rubric of what is referred to as unconventional warfare or irregular warfare. And in modern terms, you hear about this a lot in the United States when you hear about how we've dispatched military advisors to Syria who are going to work with rebel groups there. Essentially, you're creating an insurgency that can destabilize a host government that is perceived as being hostile to your interests. And this is what the Special Operations Executive really pioneered. They were the undisputed masters of unconventional warfare during the Second World War. Now, there was also a lot of intense rivalry with MI6 for obvious reasons, though there was some support in MI6 at the upper levels. But regardless, the SOE was essentially disbanded at the end of the Second World War, and some of the assets were transferred into MI6, which kind of served the basis of this, their special operations branch, which I can't remember what it was called off the top of my head. But this whole network is really curious because it turns up again in the 1980s in the UK, and this is something I just kind of recently stumbled onto due to the great work by Geoffrey Gilson in his excellent book Maggie's Hammer, which essentially concerned the death of his friend Hugh during the 1980s, who had been an SAS veteran, which was one of the kind of predecessors to the SOE. But essentially, he had been involved in arms trafficking in this capacity for the British government, and Gilson had come to the conclusion possibly that some of the money that he was generating from arms trafficking was being used to sponsor black scientific research, essentially, that was related to the Strategic Defense Initiative, the UK's contribution to it. The SDI was Star Wars. It was dreamed up in the United States by Stephen Posney in the early 70s, and it essentially became a reality going into the 80s with Reagan becoming the president. And Star Wars, there's a lot of dispute about what it was up to. It seems like a lot of the research was just a massive boondoggle to waste taxpayer money on, but there are indications that there were some really nefarious projects that were being housed within the SDI, and some of this may well have been related to modern forms of behavior modification, to mind control, and so forth. So you have kind of this network of special operations people that, at least in the UK, there's compelling evidence that we're generating money for this kind of black research through arms trafficking and so forth. So yes, in a roundabout way, this might have been a continuing project for decades now. I'm still looking into kind of the US, end of this, but it definitely seems like this kind of network of special operations personnel has been involved in generating illicit funds for this kind of black research for a considerable amount of time now. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to your question.
All right. And then, so there's that, and then there's also the Joint Special Operations Command. Is this a completely separate entity, or is that related?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, obviously, the Joint Special Operations Command is based in the United States, and it was a modern institution that was first created in the 1980s. And the backbone of the JSOC personnel is the Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. And they are not involved in unconventional warfare. That's one of the distinct differences. Generally, in the US, when you want to engage in unconventional warfare, you send in the Army Special Forces, which are more often known as the Green Berets. The Green Berets are the masters in the United States of unconventional warfare. That is their forte. That is what they were always designed to do. Now, the Green Berets were put into Vietnam, and that put them into kind of a curious situation. Green Berets were designed essentially to create insurgencies. In Vietnam, they were being used to suppress an insurgency and support a government that was friendly to the United States, and this was not what they had been designed to do. And as such, their performance was a bit mixed in Vietnam, to put it mildly. And that's like what led to the creation of the Delta Force and SEAL Team 6. I should point out, like, regular Navy SEALs are more like the Green Berets. SEAL Team 6 is distinct from the regular Navy SEALs. So SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force are created in the late 70s, early 80s, and their mandate was counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. And what that amounts to, if you want to go into the mountain or the jungles of Yemen or something like that and track down figures with Al Qaeda or whatever the current terror organization we're fighting this week is, and kill them, you send in the Delta Force or SEAL Team 6. That's their mandate. They kill people, they destroy insurgencies, they destroy terror networks. That's what they were designed to do. And that's somewhat different than the mission of the Green Berets and the Special Operations Executive. But they did have the same kind of global mandate that the SOE did. And they were essentially trying to take the Phoenix program to an international level. And Phoenix, in turn, had been based upon Operation Jedburgh, which was a World War II era program that the SOE and the OSS had set up. So there was kind of an indirect connection between the two, but the mission is somewhat different as to what the SOE was designed for and what the Green Berets were, or excuse me, what JSOC was designed for. But basically, the SOE was there to create an insurgency, and this was a method that was picked up by the Green Berets in the United States. JSOC and the associates of JSOC are there to destroy insurgencies, to put it in a really simple context.
All right, and then we have these private entity like the Blackwater group, and I think like Blackwater ties into the Knights of Malta somehow. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of rumors that Eric Prince was a member of the Knights of Malta. I haven't been able to confirm that, but definitely there was Schmidt, I think the guy's name was. At least one of the high executives in Blackwater had been linked to the Knights of Malta. And yeah, I mean, definitely the rise of the paramilitary companies, the private military companies in the United States have been most ominous, and this kind of, further gangsterizes the special operations community, so to speak. Of course, again, the origins of the private military companies really go back to the UK in the 1960s. Essentially, Britain could no longer afford its empire anymore, and they started to close down military bases and concede territories overseas en masse. But there were certain elements within British society who still wanted to maintain influence in these territories. And that was what led to the creation of the first, what is generally considered to be the first modern private military company, which was called Watchguard International. It was founded by a man named Sir David Stirling, who was one of the founders of the Special Air Services. And this basically led to this kind of black network of SAS men that worked for these various PMCs, such as Control Risk Limited and Keeny Meany services and so forth throughout the 70s and the 80s, carrying on these black projects. This became especially prevalent during the Iran-Contra era in the 1980s, when a lot of these groups were involved in uh, arming the Contras, training them, and a lot of this type of stuff. Specifically, Keeny Meany was really big in this. And then going on to the 90s, a lot of these groups played a major role in Africa after the end of the Cold War. Of course, the really legendary one was Executive Outcome, the PMC that had been founded by South African former military personnel, but also had a lot of British involved in it. And this, was a network this was an ideal, a concept that was really picked up by the Americans during that same time frame in the 90s as well. And it's something that Trump has really become obsessed with recently, especially when you're seeing a lot of these discussions about, outsourcing essentially our war in Afghanistan, letting Eric Prince and a lot of his old Blackwater cronies take over this. But that's essentially what the British have been doing now for decades. The SAS is basically used as a farming ground to train these elite soldiers, and then they transfer over to these PMCs, and then they can carry out these, objectives in these foreign countries with a lot of plausible deniability, but also saving the US government a lot of money in the process. Of course, the British frequently would rely on a lot of foreign powers to fund these operations, especially the Saudis and that type of thing. And I think that's the direction that Trump is trying to go in at this point in time, as the United States' own financial resources are starting to diminish. Now we can get outside funding, and we can still carry out these American objectives to these contractors, if you will. And I've seen in Gilson's work that there also seems to have been a very close link with the British partners with these kind of orders of knighthood as well, which I found to be, incredibly interesting. The Knights of Malta are one, of course. There's also the quote unquote official order of St. John. I say that because there's also the rather infamous American Sovereign Order of St. John, the Shikshinny Knights of Malta, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
that is not officially connected to the British group. There's the Knights of Lazarus. So there's just this really strange netherworld where you've got these, elite soldiers who are involved with these orders of knighthood, who are also involved with these private military companies, and possibly also this kind of black research that we were discussing earlier as well.
Yeah, and then so the Knights of Malta, that also has a big play within the Vatican. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're one of the top, kind of reactionary forces in the Vatican, along with Opus Dei and the Legionaries of Christ and a few of these other groups. The Legionaries of Christ was actually a Mexican outfit. It's not very well known in the West, but it had a lot of influence in South America and so forth during a lot of the latter half of the 20th century. It had actually emerged out of the Mexican Civil War that was fought at the beginning of the 20th century. The white movement had been kind of the reactionary movement. It was really interesting because on the flip side of the coin, the revolutionary movement had a lot of Freemasons and what have you involved in it, and then the whites ended up spawning these kind of secret Catholic organizations like the Legionary of Christ and the Mexican Synarchist movement, Los Tecos, and a lot of these other strange groups. But Legionaries of Christ eventually became almost a kind of Opus Dei-like outfit. It became a very prominent lobby group. It had gained a lot of political influence in South America and even to some extent the United States, though it wasn't well publicized. But it eventually kind of fell apart after the founder was revealed to have been an arch pedophile, including even sexually abusing, I believe, several of his own children. So it really went into decline after the 90s, but it does still have some influence. Opus Dei was a Spanish outfit that was founded either the teens, the 20s, in the 20th century. It was also a very well-funded, very powerful organization that seems to have aspired to be kind of a private intelligence network from early on. The founder was very conspiratorial in nature, but it's also seems to be much more of a full-blown cult. I mean, it's certainly possible that within the Knights of Malta, there's kind of a cultic inner circle as well, but I mean, there's not really, much dispute that Opus Dei certainly functions very much in a cult-like faction by isolating members from one another, and routine confessions are required. People routinely flog themselves, just all kinds of crazy stuff.
In the Knights of Malta, they they also have membership. Also, is it the P1 and the P2 uh, sections of the Freemasonry, or is that correct?
Yeah. A lot of the within P2, it definitely seems like a lot of the upper echelon people were involved with either the Knights of Malta or Opus Dei. P1, I think P1 was actually in France. I'm not really sure there, but P3 was the Spanish one, and definitely there were a lot of connections with the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei as well. And there was also, of course, P7, which was based out of Belgium, which also had some kind of contacts to people that were linked to the Knights of Malta and the Academy through Le Cercle and things of that nature.
Okay, and then so I wanted to talk a little bit about like the structure and the hierarchy of the Vatican, because there's just so many different. I don't, you got the Knights of Malta, you got the Cardinals, there's the Pope, and then I think I've heard it called the Black Pope. Do you have any kind of something you could elaborate on about that?
I think the Black Pope, if I'm not mistaken, is believed to be the supreme commander of the Jesuits, right?
And then so who are the Jesuits?
Society of Jesus, they were founded in the 16th century, so they're much older than Opus Dei, but not as much as the Knights of Malta. Of course, the Knights of Malta go back to the Knights Hospitaller, from the Crusades era. I believe they were founded in the 12th century, 11th century, possibly somewhere around that time frame. The Jesuits were a latter organization, and the Jesuits never obviously had the paramilitary characteristics of the Knights of Malta. The Knights of Malta obviously had been involved in the Crusades and a military function, and then after they were driven out of the Holy Land, they had become a major naval power. within the Mediterranean. In fact, arguably they were the preeminent naval power until the 16th, 17th century or something of that nature. The Jesuits were always more of I would say kind of an intelligence gathering network. I've even seen it described as the Knights of Malta being the military arm of the Vatican and the Jesuits being the intelligence arm, though it's probably rather simplistic, but certainly when the Jesuits first emerged, I could definitely see that being the case. But over the years, of course, the Jesuits and the Knights of Malta seem to have really developed a rather bitter struggle. Of course, as I said before, Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta were kind of at the forefront of the really right-wing reactionary faction within the Vatican, and then conversely, the Jesuits were at least somewhat more progressive. I don't know, relatively speaking, obviously, but a lot of the dispute had gone into liberation theology, which the Jesuits, at least a faction of the Jesuits, had supported, and which Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta were fanatically opposed to. And this really kind of played into some of the intrigues with John Paul II. John Paul had been brought to power with a lot of support from the Knights of Malta and Opus Dei, and when he became the Pope, he essentially sacked the Supreme Director of the Jesuits and appointed his own guy there in an attempt to try to drum out the support for liberation theology. And now, kind of in a reverse course with Pope Francis, who was himself a Jesuit. He's kind of done the same thing to the Maltese Knight, eliminated their, or not eliminated, but sacked their Grand Master and put his own guy in charge. And now they've even gone so far to, I think, essentially trying to require the Knights of Malta to give up all of their material possessions, all of their money and everything to the order, essentially to be members of it, which, given the aristocratic and very wealthy nature of the Knights of Malta, that would not be a very acceptable policy for a lot of the membership. So certainly there's been a lot of intrigues between these two groups for a number of years now. For a lot of the latter half of the 20th century, the Knights of Malta were on top, but it definitely looks like the pendulum has maybe swung back a little bit to the Jesuits in recent years. And that probably in some way is related to the ongoing Vatican pedophile scandal. Of course, Pope Benedict had his sudden, resignation a couple of years ago, which led to Francis coming to power. Benedict was really close to Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta, and there's been some speculation that he might have been at the forefront of trying to cover up some of the, pedophile scandals in the Vatican. So who knows? Maybe the Jesuits figured out that he had done more than simply try to cover up some of these scandals. Maybe he was an active participant, and that had led to his forced resignation. It's certainly interesting, especially since the Vatican is, really almost a relic from the Middle Ages. Its whole political structure is really like a kingdom from that era. So you kind of have this whole Game of Thrones-esque kind of series of intrigues playing out right now before our very eyes.
And then between the Knights of Malta and the Sovereign Order of St. John, in terms of hierarchy, is one kind of answer to the other, or is that something they kind of are just one branched out of the other? Because I know with the Sovereign Order of St. John, I think there's a couple generals or Marines that were kind of members of that group, and then that kind of connects somehow with the Knights of Malta.
Well, kind of. Okay, the official Sovereign Order of St. John is actually a British outfit. And that went back to the schism to when, Britain became a Protestant nation, and essentially the knights there could no longer swear allegiance to the Pope, so they kind of came up with this alternative order that would be a Protestant Knights of Malta, essentially. So technically, in that sense, the two orders are separate from one another, though they've still maintained a lot of contact. Now, the group you're talking about is the Shik-Shini Knights of Malta, and that was an American body that emerged in the 1950s. Now, this outfit claimed descent from the Knights of Malta going back to the Russian line of succession. And this was after the Knights of Malta were essentially kicked out of Malta at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. And for a couple of years there was a lot of question as to what exactly would become of them. And some of the knights relocated to Russia, where they were given, some assistance from the Tsar, who was set up as the patron there. Now, this group officially petered out pretty early in the 19th century, but in the kind of mythological history of the Shikshini Knights of Malta, the descendants of the Russian members had eventually immigrated to the United States at some point in the early 20th century, late 19th century, and they had eventually decided to revive the order at some point in the 1920s. There are some kind of marginal groups that have vague connections to the Shikshini group that have been traced back to that era. But the Shikshini Knights of Malta really got going in the 1950s, and this was when, this bizarre order of knighthood was suddenly able to attract all of these, high-ranking generals and admirals. You're talking about people like General Charles Willoughby, who was MacArthur's spy master during World War II in Korea. I mean, he had essentially managed to keep the OSS and later the CIA out of the Far East, which essentially made Willoughby the most senior intelligence officer in that entire region of the world from the early 1940s until MacArthur was removed in the Korean War. So around 51, 52, there was Admiral Charles Cook, who had helped set up the relations with Taiwan, which had helped facilitate a lot of the opium traffic from that region of the world. There was Philip J. Corso, Colonel Philip J. Corso, who had helped set up some of the Gladio networks in Germany, and who later wrote The Day After Roswell, who became a major figure in the UFO community for a few years before his death. Another really bizarre figure was Cleve Baxter. It's Baxter, I can't remember which, but he had been a CIC officer, an interrogation specialist who had later transferred to the CIA. There's a good chance he might have been involved in some capacity with Artichoke, but I have not been able to confirm that. But he later, in a really bizarre turn of events, had started to propose this theory that you could communicate with plants by hooking a lie detector up to them, essentially. And this had eventually inspired a book called The Secret Lives of Plants, which was written by two former OSS officers, Christopher Bird and Peter Tompkinson, I believe, in the 70s, and has still kind of remained a prevalent theory in some New Age circles, bizarrely. So there were some really strange characters that were involved in this outfit. But as far as their relations with the Knights of Malta, the official ones are concerned, they typically presented themselves as opponents of it, and I believe they had even sued the official sovereign order of what was it, the sovereign. Shoot, I can't remember what it's called. The official Knights of Malta.
Mhm.
They had tried to sue them at a few points over trademarks and the names and just all kinds of crazy stuff. But uh, at the same time, a lot of the Shikshini guys were involved in this organization, the International Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture in Europe, which had been founded, I believe, in France, and it had several people like Anton Panay, who were very prominent Knights of Malta. So they're kind of, on the one hand, collaborating with the official Knights of Malta in some capacity, but on the flip side of the coin, they're throwing a lot of lawsuits at each other. So
Mm.
a lot of this, I'm guessing, was probably a bit of theater. There probably were much more closer collaborations going on behind the scenes, but these groups definitely put a lot of effort towards depicting themselves as being arch enemies of one another.
And then there's I think a General Pedro de Valle. He's a member of the Sovereign Order of St. John. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah, the Shikshini one, yeah. Del Valle was quite a piece of work, to put it mildly. I mean, this guy ended up, supporting the American Nazi Party of George Lincoln Rockwell and what have you. He was a huge figure and spreading Christian identity theology, which is almost a kind of, racist Gnosticism. Essentially, it depicts white Europeans as being the true Jews of the Bible, and the actual Jews as essentially being subhuman, satanic figures. A description, I suppose, that could essentially be applied to all other non-white people in this rather toxic ideology. And Christian identity theology has underpinned a lot of right-wing terror organizations for years now. The National States Rights Party, for instance, one of the big figures in that was J.B. Stoner. He was a Christian identity adherent who had been involved in the bombings of several African American churches in the 50s and 60s. There was Fraser Glenn Miller, a longtime FBI informant. He had been linked to the shooting in Greensboro in the late 70s. He eventually was thrown in prison when he shot up a Jewish synagogue just a couple of years ago. The Christian Identity Network has also been linked to Oklahoma City. Timothy McVeigh had spent time at Elohim City, which was a Christian identity compound. And then more recently, you have Israeli Keys, who was a serial killer who had been brought up in the kind of Christian Identity Network. This group's also been linked to, the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then more broadly speaking, the SOSJ. I mean, it turns up in a lot of this stuff. It also turns up in the Kennedy assassination. In fact, David Ferry, the arch pedophile who had been Lee Harvey Oswald's friend since he was a teenager, had actually been ordained a priest by a guy named Carl Maria Stanley, who had been involved in the Sovereign Order of St. John. So yeah, I mean, DeValley was a really sinister figure. He had helped set up Christian identity theology. He had also helped set up the militia movement and the sovereign citizen movement, which all of these things have been a fertile recruiting ground for right-wing terrorists for years now in the United States. And this has led me and several other researchers who have looked at the SOSJ to conclude that it was essentially a kind of coordinating body, if you will, for the American version of the Stay Behind armies or Gladio or whatever exactly you want to call it.
So what's up with the Gladio networks? What's that all about?
Well, the Gladio networks, well, Gladio was officially the name of the Italian component, I should say. Like, we don't actually know what the broader network was called. Usually it's just referred to as the Stay Behinds or the Secret Armies or something to that effect. But it was set up essentially at the very end of the Second World War, going into the early Cold War. And it was really modeled after some of the special operations executives' infiltrations into Nazi territory and their ability to set up, stay behind networks and so forth. But essentially, the theory was that if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe, these stay-behind networks would wage a guerrilla war against the Soviet Union through assassinations and sabotage and that type of stuff, and not unlike how the SOE assets had operated in France, for instance, during the Second World War. Anyway, that was the theory. In practicality, it seems like these stay-behind networks had actually been used to facilitate terrorism and so forth for years in Western Europe to essentially destabilize the governments there and ensure that they remained within the U.S. sphere of influence. And this was especially prevalent in Italy. Italy had had a very strong communist movement going back to the Second World War, and there was a perpetual fear that Italy would fall out of the Atlantic Bloc and would fall into the Soviet sphere if it was not carefully managed, let's just say. And as such, a lot of the terrorism that emerged during a period known as the Years of Lead from the 1970s into the 80s has been linked to this Gladio network in Italy.
The Knights of Malta, did they have a branch, like something that was the Panay Circle that was based out of Europe? Was that branched out of the Knights of Malta with, was it Vernon Walter and James?
It probably branched out of it. The founders of the Panay, of the Cercle, the Panay Circle, were Anton Panay, Jean Violet, who were both Frenchmen. From Germany, there was Konrad Adenauer and Franz Joseph Strauss, and then from Italy, there was Giulio Andreatta. I'm not pronouncing that right, but sorry about that. But as far as those go, at least two of the guys, actually three of them, Violet, Panay, and Andradia, were Knights of Malta. Konrad Adenauer almost surely was a member of the Knights of Malta, but I haven't been able to officially confirm that, though. And Violet and Franz Joseph Strauss and I believe Andradia also had close ties to Opus Dei as well. So basically, all of the founders were linked to one of these two kind of reactionary Vatican orders. So it's very possible that it had kind of grown out of this network, the Knights of Malta and the Opus Dei networks. But I haven't been able to completely confirm that, but it's very telling that there were so many Opus Dei and Knights of Malta members among the early Circle membership.
Okay. And then just one last question. With the Knights Templar assassins, is that the Knights Templars, those are separate from the Knights of Malta?
Well, the Templars were another one of the crusading orders from the Middle Ages. They had predated the Knights of Malta somewhat, and the two entities had eventually become something of rivals in the Holy Land. And eventually, when the Templars were suppressed, it was kind of advocated by John J. Robinson in his book Born in Blood that the Knights of Malta had been one of the figures that had contributed to the suppression of the Templar Knights. Of course, like I said, they were rivals, and the Knights of Malta benefited tremendously from the suppression of the Knights Templar because they got a lot of their former lands and some of the members and so forth. So a lot of money, a lot of personnel were brought into the Knights of Malta through that. So yeah, there does seem to have been, you know, some kind of rivalry, a rather bitter rivalry between these two groups. The basis of it, is highly speculative. I would guess it probably had something to do that was, uncovered in the Holy Land by these orders at some point. Of course, they were, rubbing elbows with the Hessasians and the, Yezdis, the Mandeans, and a lot of these other kind of Gnostic sects there. Well,
Yeah.
kind of to go on with the Templars too, of course, there's a lot of speculative theories about the Templar after they were suppressed that they had actually served as the basis of the Freemasons. And of course, going forward, there had been this kind of ongoing rivalry between the Freemasons and the Knights of Malta, and that's kind of what made the propaganda lodges in Europe so kind of ironic because they were essentially controlled by the Knights of Malta, even though they were a Masonic lodge. And there's been some speculation that this was almost kind of a kind of sinister joke, almost, if you will, on their behalf. Like basically, well, we're going to use the Masons for our own purposes, and they can't stop us, type thing. I mean, who knows?
And then you're saying with the propaganda lodges, that's referring to like the P1, the P2, and P7.
Yeah, P1, P2, P3. Yeah, yeah,
Are there
yeah.
lodges in between that, or is it just weird? It just goes 1, 2, and
Most likely, I mean, most likely it's just they've never really been exposed, but it seems like the propaganda lodges were set up all over Western Europe, and because they've also been very closely related to a lot of the Gladio networks, as were a lot of the founders of the Circula. So most likely, I would guess there were other propaganda lodges in other countries. It's just that nothing has ever really come out about them. And even in general, as far as P1 and P3 and P7 are concerned, there's very, very little information available about these lodges either. I mean, I think really Robert Hutchinson's Their Kingdom Come and David Teacher's long suppressed History of the Circula are the only ones that have really dealt with these entities. So unfortunately, there's a lot of history missing here that's just never come out, and it's quite possible it never will at this point.
yeah. All right. Well, wow, this has been amazing. I really appreciate your time. I wanted to ask you one last thing. What new stuff are you working on, and what have you been researching?
Well, the big thing I've been working on right now is the book, A Special Relationship, that's going to deal with the kind of strange family connections between the Profumo scandal that broke out in the UK in the early 60s and the kind of broader Anglo-American kind of private intelligence networks that surrounded Profumo and had existed going back to the interwar years. I'm talking about groups like the Room, the Walrus Club, the Ends of the Earth Club, and then later a lot of these old networks kind of congregated around the World Commerce Corporation. And a lot of these families, would later turn up in Profumo, and then they would still turn up in Epstein. And that's really been the center of a lot of my research right now. And it's incredibly fascinating to just see all of these connections and so forth. Uh, but yes, I'm optimistic that I can hopefully finish that book in early 2020 and maybe get it out in time for the elections. Who knows? But it's really going to be, I think, a really compelling study of these networks and how it kind of ties into this day with Trump on the one side of the Atlantic and Brexit on the other side of the Atlantic, because this network really seems to have been behind the rise of both of these Trump's populism, I should say, and Brexit, these two kind of movements. So I'm really excited about that, and that's really been kind of at the forefront of a lot of my research and topics that I'm sort of uncovering that related to it. That's one of the reasons why, for instance, I've started to get really interested in these black projects and them being funded by, you know, sex trafficking and drug trafficking and so forth, because it definitely seems like this old kind of World Commerce Corporation network was at the forefront of these efforts, or at least launching them way back in the day.
Wow, that's awesome. That's so much more to talk about. um, all right, well, is there anything you want to leave the audience on?
I think that's about it for now. Obviously, check me out at visaview.blogspot.com if you want to see more, you know, information on some of the topics that are being discussed, and definitely keep in mind the book that's coming out. You know, I'm not sure how things are going to go getting it published. I've got another book project, of course, right now that's also ongoing with Frank Zero. That one's done, except for the editing. That's in Frank's court now. He's hopefully going to be done with that soon, and we'll hopefully have that one coming out maybe early next year. But Special Relationship, it's definitely going to be interesting seeing how you know, that gets published, if I end up having to maybe self-publish it or something. But definitely might be some crowdfunding necessary for that in the future. So I'm hoping that enough people will be interested in it. If it comes to that, they might be able to help me out with that. But yeah, all I can say is I've got some projects coming forward. They're going to be really interesting, especially the one with Frank that should hopefully be coming out in a couple of months. That's going to go into a lot of the material I've discussed here with private military companies and JSOC and the SAS and a lot of that kind of stuff. And then going forward, a Special Relationship is really, I think, going to be a thorough examination of these black networks spanning a lot of the 20th century. So hopefully, I mean, I'll get some people as excited about these projects coming up as I am.
Wow, that's amazing. I'm excited. All right, well, I appreciate it again. Thank you so much.